screaming.
Wow.
The Nick was 43. 43. Now wants me to connect with 43. No. That would mean I would have to, yeah.
You're fine. That's what happened when you go live.
But it never happened.
The weekly sermons of 45th Street Baptist Church are now available as a podcast through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts.
At your house over the weekend, we just go home.
You're welcome to come to the house anytime.
Always come up with 10 minutes for show service. Why? So I mean,
Well, now, in fairness, I was asking why the last time.
that's how we put it. That was good. I don't know. Stuff changes every single day. Definitely stuff.
I was trained. Why? Oh. You can't tell me that. That means I can make up one. I can plug in myself. That doesn't always help. There he is.
Oh, wow, we into that tonight.
I love paper chase.
Okay, so I'm not the co-host. It's somebody waiting to be.
Karen is called. Man. You can hear me, okay? Thank you very much. The mic is picking me up right here. Hearing.
know how powerful this is? Do you know what it means in your life? Or maybe I should ask the question, does it mean anything?
Since you didn't got this degree and everything,
Until you learn how to
change
study,
stuff up.
see what God is saying to you, you'll never really be able to fulfill your purpose. Come and join us. Join us for 45 minutes of purpose here at 45th Street Baptist Church. I guarantee you'll come out thinking differently. And my prayer is, somewhere along the line, you'll find the purpose that God has for you. Come on in and join us.
Welcome to 45 Minutes of Purpose with Reverend Andra D. Sparks.
All right. Good evening, everybody. We've been having a great time here
already.
I'm so thankful that we're here today.
Thank God for the opportunity to share in this Bible study with you. Change the angle on this, Greg. We thank God that you're here tonight.
Call Karen and see what she calls. Yes.
So tonight we're in a new study. We're in the book of First Kings, lesson 11. Lesson 11.
Those of you who haven't been with us in a couple of Sundays, probably in a couple of Wednesdays, have probably gotten off track because we stopped with me putting the number on the lesson around lesson 6, and then we had 3 guest teachers. And so last week would have been lesson 10, and this is lesson 11 if we're going chronologically. And I'm so grateful that we get the opportunity to do this, because this, my friends, starts a rich part of the study of the Bible. This is a rich part of the history. This starts a rich part of the history. And I'm grateful that we're able to have an opportunity to share in this. Can you hold on 1 second, please? All right, we are going to get into this tonight. The book of First Kings is an account that bridges 2 of the greatest leaders in the history of Israel. One we've already talked about for quite a while now. In our last lesson, we studied the life of King David. And so we get into the book of First Kings, and King David is leaving us, literally. It's his death. We start out with his death. And naturally, the determination has to be made, who will be his successor. And so let's harken back to one of the major points in King David's life. And that would be the one that he repented of in Psalms 51, the sin he committed in having Uriah killed. Uriah, as the Bible said, the wife of Uriah, her name was Bathsheba. And the author of 2 Samuel was extremely pointed in that, making sure that we understood that she was not David's wife, she was Uriah's wife, and David's behavior was criminal and sinful. She was, in fact, the wife of Uriah, but to that union was born a child, and that child, we know, did not live. But another child was born to David and to Bathsheba, and his name was Solomon. And Solomon would become the heir to the throne of David upon David's passing. Very poetic if you look at the language. David, for all his negatives, was a nurturing father, at least to Solomon. He prepared the way for him to do some things that God told him he couldn't do. David's fervent desire was to build a temple for the Lord. And the Lord told David that he had too much blood on his hand. He had simply been involved in too many battles. Let's think about that for a minute now. David came to prominence in Israel because he happened to be delivering a DoorDash package to the battlefield for his brothers while they were there. I mean, Daddy placed the order and David delivered supplies to his brothers. And when he was there, he came upon the most fervent display of cowardice anyone could ever witness. From the king down to the lowest ranking person in the military, they were all cowed by the Philistine army. And in particular, they were cowed by Goliath and his brothers. And Goliath was gloating over the fact that not one person in the army, Israelite army, had the courage to take him on. And not only did he do that, you know, when I was growing up, it's one thing to be talking about somebody, but then you invoke somebody who's in authority over them. It didn't matter who it was. This is almost like Goliath looking at them and saying, and your mama too. When he did that, he didn't say, and your mama too, but he said something about the Lord. And David took mighty offense to the fact that not only are you disparaging us, but you're also saying that our God is worthless. And so in the name of the God who was being disparaged, David said he would take on the Philistine, which in fact brought on great laughter. So he ended up killing the Philistine. Goliath killed him, cut his head off, and as proof that he had done it, which brought him great acclaim at a very young age. But David's entrance to public life in Israel started with blood on his hands. And because he became a mighty man of valor at that point, he then became the general of the armies, the leader of the armies. And so the king, who saw his courage, kept sending him into battle after battle. This was problematic later because he was good in battle. God had put his hand all over him and gave him favor. Not only that, no doubt David was very charismatic. Hey, he was a musician. You know, he wrote songs, always writing. And so he had the ability, I'm sure, to spin a word really quickly to people, and he could convince them to his side. And as we go through all of the historical review of 2 Samuel, we see that David and his band of men spent a lot of time just in war. So it's little wonder that David had blood all over his hand. But as much as God loved David, he even called him a man after his own heart. God is so pure and just that he could not let someone who had had that much experience in war lay the foundation for a temple that would be devoted to him. And so David, in his love for his son, David and his love for the kingdom, decided that he could still help build the temple. He would simply have to buy all the resources, have all the resources set aside for his son. Now, you know, it's one thing, and this is probably an object lesson in our lives today, and this gets us deeper into this First Kings story. There's one thing for parents to prepare the way for their children, but if you prepare the way and forget to give them direction, then that creates problems. And David made sure that he gave direction to his son, Solomon, as he knew he was leaving, as he knew he was dying. He called his son in and he told his son that he should acknowledge the Lord in all his days and in all his ways. And if he did, then David was certain that the Lord will be with him, just as he had always been with him. And so he gave Solomon not only a legacy of wealth, but he gave him a legacy of wisdom. And that wisdom led him into solid relationship with the Lord, at least initially. And so we start out with sadness in the kingdom, and then we go into gladness with the reign of Solomon coming about. The two of these leaders are historically, even today, considered two of the most dynamic and best leaders that Israel has ever had. And so this period of time that we're studying in First Kings spans about 400 years totally, about 400 years. And it allows us to understand, not that David and Solomon lived 400 years together, but it allows us to understand the scope of First and Second Kings and how it explains how much happened in that period of time and the foundation laid between David and those other rulers that were to come. From David down to King Jehoiakim, there was great prosperity in the land. But Solomon's reign had a wonderful start. Wonderful start. He began by having in his coronation, the Lord came along and asked him what the Lord would give him. What can I give you? What a question for God to ask somebody. What can I give you? If the Lord were to ask you that question right now, what in fact would you put on the list of things that God can give you? Most people would immediately go to material wealth. Most people would say, Lord, make me rich beyond my wildest imagination, thinking that will help them deal with all the issues that they'll ever have in life. If you got enough money, you can solve anything. But now you and I both know that that's not true, because we know plenty of miserable rich people. All right. The wealth in and of itself, wealth and loneliness do not go hand in hand. All right. Wealth and misery do not go hand in hand. When you have failings in your flesh, money doesn't solve all those issues. In fact, I've heard someone wiser than me say that money can hide a multitude of sins. And it's true. We've seen that be the case in recent public history here in this country, that there are some people who have some aberrant social behaviors that they hid in wealth. And coming out, being made public, these people were then wealthy and castigated by the rest of society. And people then start making sure that they can pull away all the wealth they have because of the criminal behavior they've been involved in. And so here we have King Solomon, who is, if you will, set up for a perfect relationship with the Lord, if ever there was one. He's wealthy beyond belief. And when the Lord asked him, what will you have me? Solomon had the good sense to say to the Lord, give me wisdom. My Lord, what an intangible to ask for. Not knowledge. He didn't ask him to give him knowledge. There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Yeah, knowledge is information, but wisdom is knowing what to do with the information. And the Lord asked him, what can I give you? I'm just going to sit here and tell you right now, I'd have flunked that one. I'd have flunked it straight out, all right? Because I don't know that wisdom would have been on the top of my list to ask for. Just being honest with you. But Solomon did. And because Solomon asked for wisdom, the Bible is very clear, which I think is 3 and 9. It's very clear that the Lord showed favor on that response. And the Lord was pleased with what he asked for. And so because of that, the Lord gave him 2 things that he didn't ask for. He said, Solomon, you asked me for wisdom. And because I find that pleasing, I'm going to give you 2 other things. The first I'm going to give you is wealth beyond your imagination. So to this day, we say that Solomon is the richest man who ever lived. No one could have matched his wealth, even by today's standards. He was wealthier than anybody else. And then the Lord also gave him something else that people crave so much today, and that's fame. He said, I'm going to give you wealth and fame, couple that with your wisdom. So you're the smartest man in the world, you're the wisest man in the world, and you're the richest man in the world, my Lord. What a perch to be sitting upon. And because he was all these things, his life unfolded that way. His kingdom had exponential growth because he was so wise. He knew what to do with the resources that his father left, and he knew how to leverage the resources that his father gave him. Not only that, he was famous. Everybody wanted to meet the boy king. Yeah, and I'm imagining by those days, because he was wealthy, he struck a good pose. So all the women wanted to meet him. The fact that we later find out that he had 600 wives and concubines means that he was at least popular with a few women. And he had all these things going for him, and that creates problems. And so even though he started out wisely on this level, when he asked the Lord to give him wisdom, there was a precipitous decline in his administration. And that's made possible. That's made evident when we look at the 4 books that were written. Many people ascribe all the Psalms to David. They just, say it's a Psalm of David. Well, not every Psalm is a Psalm of David. Some of the Psalms a lot of the Psalms were written by Solomon, right? Because remember now, he got a lot from his dad, and I guess he got songwriting from his daddy. Remember, the Psalms were the hymn book of the Israelites, and so David wrote Psalms, and so did Solomon learn how to do that. But Solomon is ascribed to have written 4 or portions of 4 books: Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and of course the eponymous book that's named for him, the Song of Solomon. And clearly, Solomon used his wisdom to communicate with us. The last one that we see, well, the one that we see him at his lowest point, is not First Kings that we're talking about tonight, but in fact, it is Ecclesiastes. And this is when we see how things did not go as well as they could have. Because we see, if you will, the one who started out as the boy wonder, the one who started out as the boy king with so much promise, is now writing as an old man. And he is now telling all the people to remember now thy creator in the days of your youth. In other words, the same God that started him on a pathway to excellence, he is now, as an old man, having to remind us as young people, don't forget the Lord when you come into whatever it is he's going to bless you, because I see him in this space, chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes. I see him as a man who's writing with regret. I see him as a man who has had the world laid bare before him, who did not take advantage of the one thing that meant the most, and that was a close relationship with the Lord. He took advantage of everything else. He took advantage of relationships. He took advantage of his wealth. He bought everything he thought he could. He had everything built he thought he wanted to have built. He wined and dined, but he wasn't reverent in it. And because of that, that created problems for him. What kind of problems? Was right there. First Kings chapter 11 describes his weaknesses. And I know we've jumped all the way to chapter 11 when we first started talking about this, but it tells us where he was. And where he was that he married. The Bible says, I love the King James Version. King James Version says clearly that Solomon loved many strange women. Solomon loved many strange women. Now, you can't put that on no t-shirt. You know, I love many strange women. And then it goes on to say, and they turned his heart from the Lord. All right. Solomon loved many strange women, which really means that Solomon loved many women who were not believers in the one and only God. They were idol worshipers. That's what many strange women. So he loved a lot of women. Strange means they were not believers. And each one of them, if you will, came and pulled his heart a little bit from God. That's a sad state of affairs. And because he was so wealthy, he could put up every one of them. So every one of them come in, and he would, let me tell you how he did things. Solomon was so wise, whenever there was conflict between him and another kingdom, Solomon would go in and marry the daughter of the king. And so he would have an alliance with that kingdom and thus ensure peace. Whenever you have an alliance with that king, the one thing you did at that time was bring a dowry. So what Solomon would do is take a little bit of his wealth. He'd buy some peace with that kingdom. He'd also get the daughter as his wife. And when she came, he'd have to put her up in her own apartments or own place to stay. And he had these little apartments all over the kingdom with all his wives and concubines in it. And this is how Solomon was able to maintain order in the kingdom. It seems like a good deal, except where's the loyalty to anyone? And when I go over here and she is the worshiper of Ra, I'm going to have to worship Ra when I'm in the house with her. When I go over here and she is the worshiper of Baal, I'm going to have to worship Baal with her. That's just simply what's all over the house that he is paying for. Not only that, we can't begin to imagine how many children there were out there. So Solomon, in his haste to be at peace with folk, I guess we can say it that way, that may not be the most appropriate way, created problems in the kingdom. And can I tell you this, the one who started out with so much problem, so much promise, ended up putting the kingdom in position for its ultimate fall, because he allowed all these folk who God said do not deal with to intermarry in the kingdom, to become a part of the kingdom, and to ultimately infiltrate and lead to the downfall of the kingdom. Now, isn't that something that strikes you as strange, considering he was so wise? Yeah, clearly he wasn't wise enough to keep God first. And that's what he's saying in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. He said, now remember thy creator when you're young and when you're wealthy and when you're the most famous person in the world. And when you got all the sense in the world, have sense enough to remember God at that point in your life. Because when you get old and you set up all these problems, now can you imagine the old man that Solomon was, and all these old wives and concubines still calling on him, and he gets no peace anywhere. And that's why he can sit down and write Ecclesiastes. And so the reign of Solomon, the book opens, we find a really old man, David who's lived, by all accounts, a successful life, even though it was bloody. Even though it's bloody, it was a successful life. And he is on his deathbed. I love the political intrigue that comes out of this. Watch this. Mama's gonna always be mama, right? And let me give you this too. And not much is said about Bathsheba after the incident involving David and Uriah being killed. We know she becomes his wife, but David had other wives too. So remember now, Bathsheba was just one of his wives, but Bathsheba was the one who had Solomon, and Solomon had brothers too who thought they had claim to the throne. That becomes part of the intrigue. And Nathan the prophet confirms early on that Solomon would be a special child, that Solomon would be the one to carry the throne through. And Nathan is the one who confirms to David that the intrigue brought to him by Bathsheba is actually what God wants. Because Bathsheba comes to him and she just being mama, y'all. She come in and said, now remember, David, my king, you promised me that our baby was going to be the one who was going to succeed you on the throne. You promised that. Now, I know David had enough about him in his relationship with the Lord to say, woman, that's the Lord's business who succeeds me on the throne. And I'm sure she said, I know it's the Lord's business, but it's your business too. You told me. And so I need you to promise that you're going to support Solomon going to the throne, because you got all these other children out here too who are going to come in and want the throne. You can't imagine. This would probably be a pretty good TV show, all right, in today's time. And there may be one out there already. But David decides that Solomon should be his heir and has him crowned at once as his successor. And when he has him crowned, Solomon is anointed with the sacred oil that David had that anointed him in Jesse's living room that evening, all that time ago, when the prophet came in and said, arise, this is the one right here, God, whom God wants. Such a beautiful sight. But David ensures that the throne passes to Solomon. And then Solomon is the one who goes back to Jerusalem. He doesn't come as David's son anymore. He has changed his title. His title is now King of Israel. And now, because David has laid his hands on him, the threat to the throne that was posed by David's other son, Adonijah, is pressed down, is useless, because the king himself has laid hands on Solomon and anointed him. Now, I thought this was interesting because Mama facilitated David remembering that Solomon is the one who's going to be. Now, if we go a little bit further, can I tell you what else Mama did? Not only did David tell Solomon that he ought to remember the Lord all his days and the Lord would be with him. Can I point you to another part in scripture that you may not have been aware of? If you go to Proverbs 31, which is often quoted in scripture, everybody talks about somebody being a Proverbs 31 woman. But the truth of the matter is the heading in Proverbs 31 says that it was a message from King Lemuel, which is a pseudonym for Solomon, because Solomon wrote it, from his mother. And his mother is telling him the kind of woman you ought to look for. So in reality, what you have in Proverbs 31 is Bathsheba telling her son Solomon, when you got all this stuff, find this kind of woman. And that's the model woman that we can assume she didn't tell him something she wasn't. That even after she went through all this with David and her first husband, Uriah, she still taught her son how to choose a good woman and gave him the blueprint for it. I think it's intriguing, and I don't know if you've ever looked at it from the context that King Lemuel's mother was actually, can I say it in today's context? This is ugly, this is street, but was actually David's side piece. That's who gave him the advice on how to find a good woman. But in reality, everybody changes. And I think that's the beauty of the Bible, that God can take anyone. We always point to David as the one who, in fact, was violating God's expectation of him. But so too was Bathsheba. She sinned as well against her husband. Now, we can say that David used undue influence, because who can refuse the king? He could have had her killed if she refused to come. And in fact, that's why Nathan said he was guilty and had that man's blood on his hand, because you forced yourself on him, on her as the king. This whole thing was contrived. But in God's eyesight, there's a little bit of wrong in everybody in that situation. And so Bathsheba, I think, acquitted herself well by not only raising her son in a princely manner, but also instructing him how to find his own queen. David, if he didn't know anything else, y'all, David knew the Lord. David knew the Lord. He had a relationship with the Lord. And so he told his boy to walk in the ways of the Lord and keep his laws, keep the law of Moses all his days. And then he asked for wisdom and understanding so he could rule his people. And then he did something that was unique. Solomon created a new order when it came to ruling, because he created a cabinet of officers. He was smart enough to pick smart people and let smart people run their areas of expertise. And so this modern construct we see, particularly in our country, but in other countries as well, of a leader choosing other people to lead different parts of the country, is exhibited here in Solomon's reign. Solomon creates a cabinet. And they set about doing the very one thing that David wanted to do and couldn't accomplish, and that is building the temple. Building the temple. I love the imagery that comes from Solomon building the temple. He was so deliberate in it. It was so well built that historically the foundation of the building that was built is still present in Israel. That's how well made Solomon's temple was. Now you think about the thousands of years that have passed, and every piece of this temple was an organic matter, which means that over time it simply goes away. But yet there's such staying power in what the Lord allowed him to build under those circumstances that the dome of the rock still stands today over the place where Solomon's temple was built. And you can imagine what a trip in history that is if you're ever fortunate enough to go to Jerusalem and view the temple itself. I would imagine that is an overwhelming feeling. Now, other temples have been built over that spot, but there's still some primary pieces of that building still available. Zerubbabel and Herod, they built temples as well, and it was constructed on that very same spot over where Solomon built the temple, but it still remains there. And this is what's great about it. He did it. He built the temple in such a meticulous way that none of the quarried rock was chiseled away on site. It was all fabricated at a remote site, which means that when it was brought to the building site, it came in and there was no construction noise. He was reverent in his building of the temple. That's how much he loved the Lord and showed favor at that point in his life. And I love that The stones were made ready before being brought to the construction site. That's how we build buildings today. Whole lot of buildings today are prefabricated off location and then brought on location and almost put together like puzzles. Engineers will tell you that today, that is a better way of building buildings because you can maintain the strength of them when you construct them off site. And you can maintain the durability of them, and you can probably use some materials off-site that you wouldn't be able to fabricate on-site. No sound of any iron tools in that place. Solomon's reign then goes very, very well, but he does something that hurts people. He starts raising taxes. Yeah, because he's living an exorbitant and wealthy lifestyle. He's entertaining people all the time, and he has no endless supply of money, which means he got to keep on taking money from the folk to keep up his lifestyle. This is what happens when you're a playboy. This is what happens when you're a young boy. This is what happens when you become the pearl of the world, and everybody wants to come see you. Everybody wants to get the Solomon experience when they come, and the Solomon experience takes money. And the money he uses for the Solomon experience. You think about it now, when the queen of this country comes in and Solomon lays out the rich for her, she's going to go back on her journey and say, oh, we were with Solomon and we had such a grand time. And the next queen is going to say, well, us going to go visit him too. And when us comes to visit him, Solomon's got to put on the ritz for them as well. Not only that, buying all these wives and concubines takes resources. So he's got to take those resources and make sure he can keep buying future wives. Now, I don't know why he needed all these wives, but I'm sure I'm using the term wife loosely when it comes to his relationship with these folk. I'm sure there wasn't much love going on as a Tina Turner. One of them had to be named Tina Turner because she was in the background singing, what's love got to do with it? The whole time he had all these relationships going on. But he started levying taxes on the people. And guess what happens when you levy taxes on people? Even today, revolution becomes a part of the discussion. People start to revolt. People start saying the same thing under Solomon that they say now in the U.S. All these taxes ain't no good. We just working for the government. We just working for the king. We just working so Solomon can live well while we barely have bread in our coffers, while we barely can feed our children. Solomon is entertaining folk from all over the world. And guess what happens when that conversation gets too loud? Revolt starts and people start saying Solomon got to go. We don't care about all this other stuff. I'm not working to feed Solomon's 2,500 children. I'm working to feed my own children, and my children can't eat if I got to give so much of a portion of my salary to Solomon. Guess what that is? That's unrest in the kingdom. Now think about this. Solomon had the making of a kingdom that could have lasted peacefully forever, but it was his own excesses, his own vices, and his own greed. How can you be greedy when the Lord has told you he's going to make you the wealthiest man ever? These are moral failings that ultimately led to the downfall of Solomon and his kingdom. And his father, ironically, worked so hard to expand the kingdom to make sure that those portions of the kingdom promised land were under the veil of Israeli control. And now Solomon in his greed is causing revolt in those very areas that his father fought to take. I find irony in that. The daddy worked so hard. I also find similarity in that in today's young folk, that mom and daddy can work real hard. They didn't spend all their life building up some, and the children come in without appreciation, and they will whittle it away with their own excesses very quickly. It's amazing to me when we see this, that times change, people don't. People don't change. Same thing happens. Doesn't matter how wealthy they are, the next generation just don't know the Lord like the previous generation did. The further you get, isn't this a continuation of what we've been talking about in Judge? The further you get away from what God has done, the less connection you have to the Lord and the more problems you have. Solomon did something else that absolutely fundamentally changed his kingdom. He created what we know of as a navy, one of the first navies that was ever created. What happens? Because Solomon's sitting around with his cabinet of officers, and his cabinet of officers are saying to him, Your Highness, we done bled the people dry. Ain't nothing else we can get from them. They are going to come in and throw you out the kingdom immediately, or we're going to have to kill them and stop them from doing it. And so Solomon said, Well, where else is there wealth? And they said, maybe we should sell the sea and find out what other resources are. And that's what he did. He created a navy. And what happens when you create vessels that can take you to distant lands? Well, you open ports of trade with them, because Solomon said, I don't have all the resources, but guess what I do have? I got all the money. And when I got all the money, I can trade my money, I can trade my gold and other things that are valuable for the resources that they have. And so if I need new fruit and vegetables that we don't have here, my navy can go out and find the places where they are, and we can open up trade. Guess what? That's what happens right now. All the food that you and I eat isn't grown in the United States. Much of it is grown in countries around the world, and we import that. Solomon created a system in the kingdom in this dry and arid place where not a whole lot of stuff can grow. He created a system to open trade routes and trade lines of commerce. This is brilliant. But then again, we're talking about the wisest man who ever lived. Not only that, he's the wealthiest man. And he, by creating this navy, he opened up what we now refer to, well, not the first, but he opened up world trade, because his folk could go out and get whatever they needed. He also did something else that you and I still suffering from. He set up districts for taxes, tax districts. All right. And his tax districts didn't correspond with the 12 tribal districts. This was a problem, because remember now, the 12 tribes were set up with certain pieces of land. Well, Solomon, in his ruling, his tax district overlaid certain tribal lands. Oh, this is a problem. And the reason this is a problem is because he had two tribes mixed up in one tax structure. What happens when you got tax overlaying two tribes? Both of those tribes turn against you. All right. So all he did was set up immediate opposition. And when he turns up immediate opposition, plus his marital problem, all his political marriages, Solomon bought himself a revolution by the way he was ruling, which does not lend itself to the notion that he was as wise as he thought he was. All right. And maybe there's another concept here, and that is greed can overrule wisdom. Yeah, you can be too greedy for your own good. And so because he had these special tax districts set up that increased his anger, the anger of the other tribes, all right, dissension started in the north and in the south. It grew after his death, but the seeds were certainly planted by the way he was ruling. And all these political marriages to all these foreign women made peace in the land problematic. While he was alive, he was good. But immediately upon dying, the next leadership doesn't have any alliances because he had political alliances with them. That's the failure of that kind of thinking. And they brought all these other religions. So he has brought foreign women, foreign religion into the country. When he's no longer there, the country is full of pagan worship. A country that started out, Israel, that started out as God's chosen people, is now infiltrated by the leadership bringing in the wrong folk. And so at the end of his life, rebellion had already started. He's too frail to do anything about it. The northern tribes have fractured, and he tells Solomon is trying to hold the kingdom together, but God sends a prophet to a young man named Jeroboam, and Jeroboam is told that he is going to be the leader. Here's God again straightening out his kingdom of the 10 northern tribes. Yeah. 10 northern tribes of Israel. So God has already gotten to the place where he's trying to pull back his kingdom. When Solomon hears that God has sent the information, has told Jeroboam what's going to happen in terms of leadership, of course, Solomon tries to protect his own interest to have him killed. But Jeroboam gets away, and he's able to stay outside the country until Solomon dies. And Solomon died after reigning for 40 years. 40 years. And then, as the Lord predicted, there's revolution. And so one would think that Solomon has put somebody in place, right? To take up the mantle after him. And so his son Rehoboam, not Jehoram, not Jeroboam. Now these are some tricky names, but they ain't the same folk. Make sure you look at the letters on the t-shirt. All right. Rehoboam goes to Shechem to be crowned as the king of Israel. All right. But when Jeroboam hears that Solomon is dead, he comes to Israel and brings all the people of the north. And he is one who comes in on a peace mission. He doesn't come in immediately trying to take the throne, but he comes in and says, I come in as a diplomat. And all I'm asking you to do is relieve the people of some of the heaviness of the taxes that you have. This is what he asked Rehoboam. And Rehoboam responds in a way that ensures there's going to be war. He tells him, not only am I not going to lift the taxes, I'm going to make sure that the yoke on you is heavier than it was when my father was the king. Now, if those aren't fighting words, I don't know what is. We come in peace, but we're going to give you more of the problem that you're complaining about. Greed and unfair taxes ultimately led to the downfall. And so Jeroboam, who was a diplomat, turns into an absolute adversary, and he takes the northern tribes in, and they set up a confederacy. They declare independence from the rest of the kingdom. All right, and they set up their own kingdom. And this is how we get the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and we start living in the divided kingdom. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and the capital of the northern kingdom was Samaria. The southern kingdom was called Judah, and the southern kingdom's capital was, as we know, Jerusalem. All right, so we have a northern kingdom and we have a southern kingdom, Israel and Judah. In the span of King Solomon's rule, he has lost the kingdom that his father worked so hard to unite. It's sad. It's sad. So almost all the territory that had been conquered during David's reign was lost. Yeah. Not enough friends to keep that from happening when you've been so cruel in terms of your taxes. And I was really, as I was preparing this, I was saddened to hear that Solomon in his greed had wasted all his dad's great work, all the blood. Think about all the wars that were fought to secure the kingdom. And here it is, over the greed of this next dynasty, it's been lost. And so the kingdom that was once the great kingdom of Israel is now two small states, Judah and Israel. And they barely had the amount of land that the original tribes had when they came into the promised land. After all these wars, they had lost all that space, all that war, all that bloodshed. Seems like it was for naught. The last part of 1 Kings ends with the introduction of perhaps the greatest prophet who ever lived. His name was Elijah. All right. Chapter 17 through 22 details the ministry of Elijah. Elijah means God, Jehovah is God. And if you look at his life, That's exactly what was exemplified in it. He is, without a doubt, considered the most outstanding of the prophets, and is spoken of by all historians more than any other prophet in the New Testament. He is often quoted. And so, two highlights of his ministry, and we'll say this and then we're out of here tonight. Two highlights of his ministry is, one, he prophesied as the Lord told him to, that it would not rain for 3.5 years. Think about that. Won't rain for 3.5 years. And guess what? It didn't. 3.5 years. And it did not rain for 3.5 years. That's in 17:1 and 18, chapter 18, verses 42 through 46. Did not rain for 3.5 years. That's a whole lot. Can you imagine how much they need rain over there? And the other thing that happened, according to chapter 18, was he confronted all the prophets of Baal and on Mount Carmel, and he prayed, and fire came down from heaven to prove that God was Jehovah. He confronted all the prophets of Baal who were under the guidance of a harlot, of a queen named Lord have mercy, her name fell out of my mouth. Jezebel. He defeated all of them. And he also proved in that space that Jehovah was God, because God was able to not only prove the sacrifice that was offered. It's a great story. I urge you to go and read it. It involves cows and a lot of water, but in the end, the fire of God is too strong for all of them. All right, I know that's a lot tonight. But that's First Kings for us. I'm so glad we had this opportunity to sharing this together. As we leave tonight, I would ask you to please be in prayer with the Osby family. Please be in prayer with them. And we'll give you more details in terms of the homegoing service for Brother Maurice II as we get it. God bless you. Take care.